Hey everyone, I'm super excited. My name's Eric Hammond, and I'm very excited to talk to you today about trees and growing trees in dry climates, and particularly in like waterwise landscapes. I Trees are my background, my passion, and so it really is a pleasure to come talk to you about them tonight. I work for Colorado State University Extension, which is a part of the outreach arm of the university. We have offices in every county in the state, and there are people like me whose job is literally to answer plant questions if you have them and can't get answers. You can find us real easy with Googling CSU Extension plus your county name. So, all right, here we go. So we're talking about trees. And I think before we get too far into it, I think there's some important things to kind of wrap our minds around. One, trees are large, complex living organisms. Sometimes we think of them, I think people think of just like the canopy of the tree, the leaves and the branches and things like that. But there's a complex system that supplies those leaves. And the leaves are, green because they have a compound called chlorophyll on them, and they're doing photosynthesis, making energy for the tree. That's what they do. Um, so they need water to do that. And yeah, the tree needs nutrients to create the leaves, and most of those things come from the soil. So there's a complex system of plumbing to get nutrients and water from the soil and take them to the leaves. And so trees' root systems are just as important as their canopies, and we oftentimes don't think about them as much. This is a pretty accurate representation of what a tree's root system might look like. They're wide and shallow, generally speaking, which is maybe not how we drew the pictures of them when we were kids, but they can be 2 to 5 times the diameter of the tree's canopy. And in Colorado, where we tend to have clayey soils, almost all the roots are in the top 12 inches. There may be some deeper, but almost all of them in the top 12 inches. So, if you're parking a car like under a tree or something, there's a potential that you're compacting the soil and harming the roots, like where you're putting the car. Or if you're trenching for a sprinkler system near a tree, you could be damaging that tree's root system and leading to maybe not decline, but stress for the tree, depending on like the type of trenching you're doing. Or more relevant to our talk today, if you were to convert a landscape from being like irrigated turf grass with a tree growing in the middle of it to something lower water, you might actually be reducing the watering of the landscape enough that it is stressing out the tree and potentially killing it. Um, so we're going to talk more about that, but just a big picture thing to wrap your mind around. This is what a tree's roots look like. The other thing to think about is that here along the Front Range of Colorado, there were not a lot of trees before Europeans colonized the area. This is at Pawnee Buttes National Grassland, kind of out there east of Fort Collins and Greeley, north of Greeley, east of Fort Collins, sort of. This is probably what it looked like. So the trees that were around were near water, so along streams, rivers, things like that. And then, of course, in the foothills and mountains are the forests that are there. Mostly evergreens, but some deciduous trees, again, mostly along rivers, streams, things like that. So this is a hard place to be a tree. There aren't a lot of trees that are just adapted to our area. So, and probably like just to like get to brass tacks, like there are very few tree species that can survive in our area without some supplemental irrigation. I'll give you some of the ones that can or might here in a second, but particularly shade trees, if you want to have a big shade tree, probably gonna have to give it a little extra water. So that's something you gotta accept. But we're gonna talk about how we can do it efficiently. So yeah, I mean, on the other flip side of that coin is that trees have a lot of value. Shade, like big, well-developed urban trees that form a canopy, and like there's like research that actually shows like living on a street with that has like a mature tree canopy can increase your happiness as much as making like tens of thousands of dollars more, which is interesting research. I don't want to like get too far in the weeds, but it turns out there's a really strong correlation between like your income and your happiness. So having trees can like make on your street can make up for that actually. Whether that stays perfect or not, I don't know. But I love what it says, so I'll act like it is. Um, they reduce noise, they intercept pollution, They add value to properties. So there's a lot of they support wildlife. A lot of trees make fruit that birds or other animals eat. So like there's a lot of good reasons to have trees, even though there aren't a lot of trees that are super well adapted to here. So what we're going to talk about is how to have success with trees while reducing water use. So the last piece that I didn't mention is that a thing that I think is important to understand is that, it takes a tree about 7 years of growing in a landscape for that tree to actually absorb carbon from the air. Like we all, they absorb carbon, release oxygen. We all learned that as kids, right? It takes 7 years for them to fix enough carbon in their trunks and branches to account for the carbon that was released in their production. So if our trees aren't living at least 7 years, they're actually a net negative for the environment. So that really like puts a point on like, well, we got to get this right with trees. We're going to go over like how to pick the right tree for the site. Probably the most important thing you can do is pick the right species for your situation. How to plant it correctly. That's probably the second most important thing you do. There's an epidemic of poorly planted trees, and poorly planted trees oftentimes die, 5 to 15 years after planting due to bad planting. It can take that long, but they can develop dysfunctional root systems and things like that. So getting planting right is really important. Post-planting care is also critical. I'll explain more about that in a bit. So that's like how we water the tree after planting while it reestablishes its root system. We'll talk about using mulch, which has gotten a little more controversial in the last few years because of concerns about fire and wood mulch. While it's great for the soil and plants, has some concerns with fire. So we'll talk about how to use it correctly. And then we'll just talk about water trees in general. And then we'll end with a bit of a discussion about what to do with your tree and if you're doing a xeric conversion for a yard, so you don't end up like this linden here in the top picture. I was called out on a site visit and they said, "Oh, this is our big shade tree, in our family place. It's looking terrible. We can't figure out why." And so I get out there and, from the car, you can tell what it is, right? You see all the dead, dry turf in the front of it. To save money on water, they had quit watering this area about 3 years ago, and it took about 3 years for this big linden to go downhill after that. So, how to avoid that if you're doing landscape conversions and want to keep the tree. So yeah, let's jump into it. We'll have a chance for questions in the middle of the talk as well. So. Okay, so when you're picking a tree species, a couple things to think about. This is a long list, but we're going to go through it quick. One is diversity. So like if you're going to plant trees, I would highly encourage you or your community to plant a variety of species, selections, families of trees. Don't plant all the same thing. We love that uniformity. Like in a landscape, I'll admit it's attractive to see all the trees that are kind of the same sized in a row. But diversity with that, but planting monocultures like that adds a lot of risk to landscapes. It means if a new pest shows up that targets the species you planted, every tree in your landscape might die. Or if we have a funky weather event that happened to affect the particular species of trees you planted, you might lose everything. Whereas if you have a variety of things, it's kind of makes you more resilient. It's kind of like an insurance, kind of also like an insurance policy against those sorts of things. So always, I would always encourage you to plant more than one thing, species, et cetera, of tree if that's possible for your situation. This is emerald ash borer, which is the latest. I guess maybe it's not even the latest anymore, but it was the last really damaging invasive pest that showed up in Colorado. It will literally kill every untreated ash tree in the area. And I could go on, but this isn't a talk about emerald ash borer. But that's one example of thing we have to watch for. We've had lots of them in the past. The tree on the left is an elm tree killed by Dutch elm disease. Elms used to be the #1 tree we planted in landscapes, and they kind of got decimated by that. A thousand canker disease of black walnuts. These are all examples of things that affect only one species or group of species of trees. So if you have a diverse landscape, maybe you lose one of the trees or two of the trees rather than the whole thing if they were all the same species. I think I'm belaboring that. I hope it makes sense. A big one for me is to think about growth rates. When I talk to people about trees, there's two things people want more than, two traits people want most in a tree. One is fast growing, which is what I'm going to talk about. The other is fall color. People want red fall color, and both are kind of problematic in landscapes along the Front Range. But in terms of the growth rate, fast growing trees tend to be weak wooded. So part of growing fast just means that they tend to be a little more weak-wooded, um, and they tend to be prone to disease issues. And that has to do with like when a tree grows, it's actually filling all the cells that are going to become the new growth are all created before, the year before. And then the tree pumps them full of water, and that leads to the growth emerging from the bud. And so fast-growing trees, one of the reasons they're faster growing is that they actually will let their cell walls stretch thinner during growth, making more growth. But that means the cell wall is thinner and more easily penetrated by like microbes that we don't want to, that are harmful to the tree. So, I always say like the tortoise and hare things like, remember who won that race? And it wasn't the hare, it's the tortoise. You're gonna have better, it may take longer for a slower growing tree like bur oak to do what you want to do in the landscape, but it's gonna be a lot less problematic in the long run for you as well. Another thing that's really important along the Front Range is planting trees that are tolerant of our soils. So we tend to have very alkaline, clayey soils here along the Front Range. There are sandy soils occasionally as well, but that means our soils have a high pH and they tend to be like poor draining, a little bit slow to warm in the spring, some other things like that. You probably all have firsthand experience with the kind of clay that's there in that picture. Um, in those alkaline conditions, a lot of micronutrients shift to forms which are not water soluble, meaning they don't dissolve into the water and the soil. And plants absorb almost all their nutrients through as being sorry, they absorb them almost all with the water they take up. So things have to be dissolved in the water for the tree to take it up. So um, in our alkaline soils, plants that aren't adapted for those tend to get deficiencies of iron, zinc, manganese, and they get a light yellow kind of highlighter color in them. Those things are involved in the creation of chlorophyll. So we want trees that survive in our soil. And the reason this is so important is we're a niche market, sad to say, for a lot of the big growers of plants in the country. So like they're growing trees for the Northeast and the West Coast, and these places tend to have acidic soils, and this is not an issue. So a lot of the trees that are sold at like the national retailers maybe just don't do that well in our soils. Freeman maple and red oak are the two biggest ones. I'll talk more about that later. We want to make sure that our the tree that we're planting is able to make it through our winters. That's another big concern. And so this has to do with like USDA hardiness zones or one way we talk about this. And we are generally zone 5 here now along the northern Front Range. So you want trees that are cold hardy to cold 5. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple because we also want trees that can tolerate the weirdness of our winters, right? Where we go from -10 to 55 in 12 hours and things like that. So the swings in our temperatures and our dry air are also problems. Um, Arborvitae is a type of evergreen that's really popular nationwide. It's like softer than a juniper, so people like that. And it's like really cold hardy. It's cold hardy even in like Michigan, Maine, and places where it's colder than Colorado in an absolute sense, Canada. But it just does not tolerate our shifting temperatures and dry air, and oftentimes it scorches out in the winter because of that desiccates. So I see people leaving the Home Depot with like a arborvitae under one arm and a blueberry under the other, and it's just like the march of death in the spring because those things just aren't going to do well here. We also want to make sure that when we're planting stuff, we think about the mature size of what we're planting. They're so cute when they're in their small little pot, but remember that, many species of trees can get quite big, right? And so you have two examples here, a tree growing under power lines, which the power line company is having to prune in this kind of very abnormal way to keep clear of the lines. Of course, I think most of us probably know that like those companies will do whatever it takes to keep the lines clear. That's their primary job. The tree's health and long-term well-being is not their concern. And there's good reasons for that. Unfortunately, it's this kind of reality. Blue spruce is a really common one. They can get huge. So and they oftentimes get planted too close to homes or sidewalks, and then weird stuff like this has to happen. Um, Also with, if firewise landscaping is a concern for you, planting one of these too close to your house or it touches your house really increases your risk if there ever was uh, you know, a fire, wildfire. Um, so anyways, mature size is really important. And then of course, water needs. That's one of the primary things that we're talking. This is the USDA drought monitor map. I think this is the most current one. I pulled it last week. If the map, this is the state of Colorado. Hopefully, y'all recognized it. If the part of the state on the map is in white, that means there's no drought. And then kind of the angrier the color gets, the worse the drought is. So you can see a lot of the Eastern Plains and Southern Colorado is not in drought. Northern Colorado it's been pretty dry. Now we've had some snow over the last couple days, so that's good. And the Western Slope is in minor drought as well. And this is not just a one-time thing. If you've spent any time here, you know that we are in drought pretty much as often, probably more often than we're not in drought here in Colorado. So we want to pick a tree that can tolerate periods of drought, knowing that there are not many trees that can tolerate long periods of drought, at least not many shade trees. Okay, so we have about an hour. I'm going to run through some species that you might think about for trees, just to give you some ideas. This is being recorded, so you can go back and look at the list if you want. Or if you shoot me an email, I have kind of an expanded list. This is kind of the short version that I'm more than happy to send to you. And my email is on the first slide. It'll also be on the last one. Okay, so these are in order from kind of moderate drought tolerance to very tolerant of drought. So these first ones are not the most tolerant, and then we're going to get more tolerant as we go through the list. I want to start with hackberry. This is a pretty common tree, and it definitely it tolerates drought. Like it's not a tree that looks happy during drought. Like it looks kind of scraggly and the leaves will scorch, but it will come through drought. You primarily plant this because it's a shade tree. It gets to be a kind of a medium to large size shade tree. It has interesting bark, like you can see in this picture. I understand that bark is like you have to be a connoisseur to be all that interested in bark, but does have interesting bark. It has a fruit that is good for supporting wildlife. Hackberries were actually an important source of protein for early humans. You can go online right now and find people making like energy bars out of hackberries. You can find recipes for that. The best species though is the European one, not ours, but you can still do it. So yeah, it's one you could definitely think about. And it's really common. You can find hackberry. You can find it at even like maybe a big box store or something. Hackberry is fairly common in the trade, and a good, pretty safe choice for a fairly drought-tolerant shade tree. One that's a little harder to find, but one which I love and I think is getting more common all the time is chinkapin oak. This is an oak that's native to like a big portion of the country, but it's kind of like in terms of being a tree in a landscape in a yard has it's not there are nicer oaks, but there aren't nicer oaks that we can really grow here. So this was a tree that was not developed nationwide and sold as a shade tree just because they had better options. But here, where it's like if it lives, that means it's a pretty good option. I think this tree has a ton of potential. Has a moderate growth rate, faster than many oaks. You can see one there at Little Valley Nursery on the left. That's kind of an older picture. Now that tree's bigger. Uh, um, and most importantly, it gets a pretty nice kind of Merlot wineish colored, wineish fall color. So it does meet one of those requirements I talked about in terms of what people want in a shade tree with the fall color. Um, Becoming again much easier to find than it used to be out there, and one I think you could definitely think about. I have one planted in my house. That's one of my favorites. A a tree you might think about if you have a little bit harsher sight is sensation box elder. So box elders are actually on the do not plant list for many municipalities, but only the female trees are the ones they're concerned about because the seeds of these box elder can attract an insect called box elder bug, which is not harmful. It's just a nuisance, but it can come into homes a great number, and people, no one likes it. People don't aren't bleeding hearts for insects, but anyway, so it attracts a lot of those box elder bugs. This is a tree that is male, so it has no flower, it has no female flowers, it cannot develop seeds. So box elder bug is not an issue with this one. It also has a little better branching structure than normal box elder, so it doesn't come up hard as much in snowstorms. Gets a nice fall color, tolerates salty water. So if you're on well water that's not of a good quality, like it's salty, this could be one you could think about. I see them doing well in parking lot islands and other kind of difficult sites all the time. Again, this is the only box elder I recommend, pretty much is Sensation, not box elder from like a conservation nursery or something. It has to be this seedless one. Otherwise, you're going to get those box elder bugs. Another tree that's kind of in this vein of moderately drought tolerant is catalpa. I'd say, again, just like hackberry, this tree tolerates drought, but it doesn't like thrive in drought. It'll let you know it's under stress. It'll look wilted and tattered and things like that. But catalpa has like this kind of like cool open pyramidal shape. It gets, of course, its claim to fame is those white flowers you see in the very dated photo based on the cars on the right. They come out early in the summer, so they're after a lot of things are done blooming, so that can make them really impactful. Um, nice show. And in the best years, it does get a yellow fall color too. It does get these pods, like you can see in this picture. Used to be called cigar tree because in a different age, kids would play with the pods like they were cigars, right? Um, so if you don't, if that mess bothers you, Catalpa might not be for you. I don't let anything with that bother me. I just mow them over with the lawnmower or whatever and move on with my life. But so Catalpa is one that if you want flowers and a moderately, at least moderately drought tolerant tree, that's one you could think about. Excuse me. There's a close up of the flowers and the leaf. Um, this one I have in here mostly as this is English oak, and it is a pretty tough tree, but I don't really recommend English oak right at the moment because we're dealing with a new pest that's, well, it's not new, but a pest that's becoming a problem with English oak. It's actually a borer of our native oaks. So I don't really recommend English oak anymore, but I have it in here as a launching pad to talk about some other cool oaks, particularly these upright hybrid oaks. So we've always had these upright oaks on the market. This is upright English oak, but they have problems. They come apart in snowstorms, things like that. You can see this tree already has a branch that's kind of coming out of it, and those long branches act as big lever. You know, they have big levers, and so they oftentimes break in snowstorms, or particularly with snow, but also with wind. Um, some of the newer selections though are hybrids. So like this is a hybrid between English oak and white oak, the true white oak, called Crimson Spire Oak, and it is like really good for fits very well into a lot of modern landscapes. It's smaller and upright, so it fits in smaller yards. It has a nice red fall color, which is everyone wants, and it is moderately drought tolerant. So I think Crimson Spire Oak is my favorite of these, but there's also Regal Prince and others that if you have a smaller yard and want a decently drought tolerant tree plus the fall color, they might be good choices for you. When I lived in Erie, I planted one. And yes, that is far too many trees for that small yard. What can I say? I'm a tree person. It was a mistake. But anyways, you can see the oak there in the middle. I think as we get to more drought tolerant trees, I want to talk about bur oak. Bur oak is a very common tree, so you can find it. It's native to a lot of the Midwest and other, that area of the country. It gets to be a very large tree in those parts, and it can get to be very large here. But bur oak is just an adaptable tree. It can tolerate being in an irrigated landscape. It can tolerate being in a drier landscape, sandy soils, clay soils. It just doesn't care. It's very adaptable. The picture on the left here, that's in Westminster, and that tree was originally planted, I was told by this homeowner, along an irrigation ditch. And eventually the city came along and put a street in, and the ditch is now gone. This person does not irrigate their yard. I don't know if you can tell from the picture. And Bur oak just keeps on chugging. So not a very showy fall color, no showy flowers, no it does make an acorn, which squirrels like. So if you want to support squirrels, I guess that's not usually high on a lot of people's lists these days, but it's good for that, I guess. But I was my silly joke I always say about Bur oak is that Bur oak is like that friend that we all have that, you know, maybe is not the most fun. They're not the one you're going to call to go out on a Saturday night, but they own a truck and they'll show up to help you move. Like they're reliable. That's what Bur oak is. It only has one issue, and that's that it gets these little galls sometimes on it, these little like nubs on the small twigs that are created by a wasp, non-stinging wasp, so nothing to worry about. But if you buy one that doesn't have those galls in the nursery, it's less likely to develop them later in life because it's your genetic predisposition. There's another one. A very common tree. Now we're getting a little bit tougher. A very common tree, maybe too common to be honest. Maybe we've overplanted this. Is honey locust. It is a tree that is very hard wooded, very strong wooded. It has a lot of disease issues, but none of them really. I mean, a lot of them, most of them, just dent it, and they just kind of keep on going. There's a little bit of a caveat to that. We had some issues with a fungal disease called thyronectria the last couple years due to weird freezes damaging the tissues of the tree. Anyways, ignore all that. But this is a tree that I think fits most landscapes. It has these teeny tiny little small leaflets about the size of your thumbnail, which is a double-edged sword. One, you don't really have to rake. at all, or deal with them. I wouldn't recommend a lot of raking anyways. It's much better to use your leaves, like mow them into whatever your landscape is. But you don't need to rake them, but they do sometimes make sidewalks slippery. Like they get kind of matted and make sidewalks slippery. So that a double-edged sword there. Gets a decent fall color and just very well adapted to a lot of different situations in Colorado, and that's probably why it's getting overplanted. So, it's not a bad one to plant, but I also think maybe we have too many in our landscapes. Michael Durr, who's kind of a woody plant legend, Dr. Michael Durr, described this one time as like a junkyard dog of a tree. And I think that's a very vivid description. It's just a tough tree, tolerate poor soils, drought, all that. So for harsher sites, and if you just like the small leaflets, it might be a good one to think about. This one was growing near this like pond at a house that hadn't been irrigated and who knows when, just like in this little spot in the cement, and it just kept going. And so I took a picture because it was just like it hadn't been watered in 5 or 6 years, just sitting there. So it probably had its roots into something. But so if you want a tree that's like honey locust, but maybe not quite so potentially overplanted. Kentucky coffee tree is one you could think about. Here's one at the office where I used to work. This is the nicest the fall color ever looks. This year was that year was the perfect year for fall color on that tree. It has not looked that good before or since, but it does get a yellow fall color. It has actually a kind of a big flower, but it hides in the leaves so you don't see it, and the flowers become these pods, just like honey locusts can have pods sometimes as well. In this case, they're very thick and woody. So that's something to be aware of. But they do have podless forms with like cute names like espresso and stuff like that. So you can find podless honey locusts if you want to try it. This is another tree that like in Tennessee and Kentucky and that neck of the woods, our country, they consider this a trash tree, like we consider Siberian elm. But again, here beggars can't be choosers. It grows here, and I think it's one that we could plant more of, especially to kind of supplement or replace some of the honey locust plantings. There are those pods. They kind of add a little bit of texture in the winter. The only thing to know about Kentucky coffee tree is that it is a bit of a when it's young, like you're gonna see one at the nursery and you're gonna be like, that Eric guy, I'm not planting this little thing because they don't branch much. So in the nursery, they just look like one big long stick. And it takes maybe, 10 years in a landscape for them to get fuller and look more tree-like. If you want a smaller tree that's very tough, one you could think about is calorie pear. You might know this by the name given one of its most famous selections, which is Bradford pear. But we don't recommend Bradford anymore. It had a terrible structure. It came apart in snowstorms. In other parts of the country, this tree, like if the people would like revoke my tree license, I guess, or whatever, my tree recommendation license, if I recommended it because it is so invasive. Like it comes up in wetlands and forested areas and things like that. Here, I have never actually seen a seed of calorie pear germinate and come up in a garden setting, and I've spent a lot of time in garden settings. So I think our climate's just not right for it. So for us, calorie pear is a very versatile tree. Um, you know, pretty drought tolerant, nice green leaves in the summer, pretty white flowers in the spring, good fall color. So a lot of seasons of interest, a lot of reason to plant it. Beware, the flowers do have a musky smell, is how I would describe it. Most people don't find it to be pleasant, so it's maybe not one to put right by your patio, although it only smells bad for, a week or so until we get a frost, usually after it flowers. So these are pears actually you see there in the picture, but they're edible, but they're not very tasty. The little teeny pears. Okay, so now one of my absolute favorites, which is begin becoming much more common that I think is worth pursuing, if maybe like trying a little harder to track one down, are these a group of maples called the Caddo sugar maples. So sugar maple is a tree you've probably seen like on the news or something. It's where one of the trees that makes the Northeast's fall color show so spectacular, along with red maple and sugar maple. Um, I already said that, sorry. Um, but it's not really well adapted to here. There are some sugar maples that do okay, but most of them don't like our heat. They don't like our dry air, all of our, essentially our climate or our soils. This is a selection of sugar maple from a naturally occurring population of sugar maples growing in Caddo County, Oklahoma, in the Caddo, I think in Oklahoma they might call them mountains or something, but they're like hills, they're like hills there. limestone hills, and they're growing in where the soil is very similar to here, and it's Oklahoma, so it's hot in the summer, and they're much so all that means they're much better adapted to our climate. So they are definitely it's more of a medium-sized shade tree. Like it's not going to get towering like a big old cottonwood or something, kind of a medium-sized shade tree. Gets a beautiful bright red fall color. That's the number one the trait that recommends it, along with being quite drought tolerant and tolerant of our alkaline soils. So Caddo is a name for this like general group of maples, and all the nurseries have now started making their own selections from those same, from that same population and selling their own variety. But usually, if you say Caddo sugar maple, a nursery will know which one they sell and be able to connect you with it. There's one called John Pear. I think there's one called like I can't remember. They've got like names like I'm not a good plant namer, but they're like firework and things like that. But ask for Caddo sugar maple, and they'll get you in touch with the one they've got. So great one. I love this tree. This is again place we used to live, and so you can see I planted one this many years back. The other maple that I think has a big future is a selection of big tooth maple called Manzano. Big tooth maple in general is actually a pretty good choice, but a lot of them are more like big shrubs. This is a more tree-like form of it. So it's a maple that's native to the southwest part of our state into Utah. So it's called canyon maple in Utah sometimes. And so this is from the Manzano Mountains in New Mexico, I believe, where they selected this. It gets a pumpkin orange fall color. It's like a small tree, so it fits a lot of landscapes. It's has drought tolerance, and I think it's one that we're going to see more and more of on the market. Again, other nurseries are making their own selections and calling them things besides Manzano, but this one is the one I'm familiar with. That's actually my graduate school research project where you see the nursery on well, both these pictures actually. Um, this tree used to terrify me because it's maples. If you grow tomatoes, you're probably familiar with the term called indeterminate, which means they keep growing and growing and growing. They don't have a set stop point for the season. And this tree is indeterminate. It'll keep on putting out flushes of growth until the end of the growing season. And this tree was always like pushing out growth like at the end of August. And I was always thinking, oh, it's never gonna get hardened off and be able to make it through the winter, but it always did in our research trial. So I think it's a good one that you could try, a little smaller. So we're getting more and more drought tolerant now. This is a native oak to Colorado. This is Gamble oak, also called what we call scrub oak. Every place around the country calls whatever their kind of shorter oak is scrub oak. Um, so these are drought tolerant. During prolonged droughts, they might get a little water, but they survive on our native precipitation in the foothills. In a landscape, they probably would like just a little irrigation. They're not going to be huge. They like to form a grove or a clump like this, so they really do need some space. If you plant them, they can get a kind of russety fall color, but very drought tolerant one you could definitely think about if you have a little space and you want to plant something that's native and very drought tolerant. This one is out of place. This is probably not quite as drought tolerant as its spot on the list would be, but very briefly, I'm probably taking too long on these trees. Um, this is what I'm very excited about, and I do think it has at least a moderate to a little bit better than moderate drought tolerance, and its name is David elm. It's an Asiatic elm. It's native to parts of China and Japan, I believe. I might be getting that wrong. But it has the exact shape as the old American elms, the Dutch elm disease killed, but it's immune to them. It's a yellow fall color. I think it's a great tree for here, and you're seeing it more and more. There's one called Choice City David elm that is available on the market these days. For a smaller tree that's very drought tolerant, this is one of my favorites. If you want an ornamental tree for a tree for a small landscape, I think Russian hawthorn is one of the best choices you can make. It is a tree that truly has like year-round interest, so there's always something pretty on it. You can see the fruit in this picture, but also it has beautiful flowers in the spring. The fruit is ornamental and it stays in the tree. Most years, anyways, it doesn't fall into the sidewalk and make a mess. And after it freezes, birds eat it. It gets a yellow fall color, and on top of all that, it has an interesting bark, so it has a feature even in the winter. This is a tree that's selected from Central Asia, where they have a climate very similar to ours, and once established, it probably can survive on just our native precipitation unless we enter a very deep drought. So this one is one that is is truly or nearly truly no extra water needed once established. I'm gonna skip this one. Ignore it. It's a pretty good tree. We don't have a lot of time. Hop tree is a native to the Southwest. If you want a small tree that has beautiful red, beautiful fall color and is native, this is a very drought tolerant plant that you could consider. You can get it from native nurseries, probably more than you're going to be able to find it anywhere else. Another very drought tolerant tree is Panicle Golden Rain Tree. Um, this is a tree that does not mind heat or rain. It's called Golden Rain Tree because it has these papery seed pods you can see in the picture there. They're not messy in the same way that like the pods of Catalpa are. Um, they just kind of blow away or get shredded by a mower. They have a yellow flower that becomes that seed that's also quite showy midsummer. So very drought tolerant trees. If you ever spend time down in the southeast corner of the state, you may see panicle golden rain trees pretty commonly down there as street trees. So they don't mind the heat. The problem is they are weak wooded, so you have to pay extra attention to pruning these to make sure they have good structure and thus are less likely to break up in a snowstorm. So there's the picture of the fall color and the flowers. So the flowers are kind of cool. A couple conifers to end us to kind of wrap it up here. This is pinyon pine. This is a native smaller pine that we have. It's native to the far end of its northern range is just northwest of Fort Collins. So, but the picture there on the left is a forest in, I believe, New Mexico, where they get like less than 4 inches of rain a year. So this is a very drought tolerant tree. I see more problems with pinyon pine being over irrigated rather than under irrigated in Colorado landscape. So for a drought tolerant evergreen, a little smaller, this is one you could think about. Austrian pine is a very drought tolerant pine that's very common. It gets to be a larger pine, a larger tree. The problem with one of the issue, not maybe not issues, but one of the challenges of Austrian pine is it's not self-limbing, so it keeps its branches all the way to the base, which can make it a problem in landscapes because the branches block sprinklers and stuff like that. Um, but Austrian pine is quite drought tolerant in terms of a conifer that you could plant. Not as drought tolerant as pinyon. Just another picture. An interesting one for evergreens that you could think about is southwestern white pine. This is native to the southwest corner of the state. It is a white pine like the famous white pines from the East Coast. I think it's a little bit more refined than our native pines of the Front Range, but very drought tolerant. So that's one you could think about as well, and it's becoming a little more common in the nursery. So southwest white pine, not just plain white pine, southwest white pine. And then finally, I think the last tree I'll cover is Cook Peak, Arizona cypress. This is a true cypress. We didn't think we could grow these here, that they would make it through the winters, but I think almost 20 years now of growing this particular selection. So they went up on Cook Peak and got Arizona cypress genetics material from the highest cypress they could find on the peak, so the coldest spot, and that's where all these come from. So they look a lot like junipers, but they're maybe a little nicer blue-green, not quite so coarse as some of the junipers. Still very flammable though, so for firewise, not for near the house. Probably not. Yeah, not for near the house. You can see all these different shapes because they reproduce these by seed, so they all look a little different because their genetics are all a little different. Oh, I guess I have a little slide here. I'll be quick. One of our native junipers, the Front Range, is Rocky Mountain juniper. And my main reason to talk about this, I know I say juniper, people's eyes glaze over, and with the current concern about firewise landscaping, we don't want junipers close to the house. But if it's not close to a house, they are a very well adapted plant for our area. And there's been a lot of work to make selections of Rocky Mountain juniper that are superior, more attractive, things like that. So this one is moon glow. It has the color of a blue spruce. There's woodward there on the left. That's more of an upright form that is attractive. There's also collow green, gray gleam. All those are great, well adapted plants, just not for near homes because of the firewise implications, if that's a concern for you. Just moon glow close up. So any questions I can answer now, I can bring up the Q&A, or if there's anything that was coming up over and over again, I'm happy to try to answer it real quick. Take a little break.
Yeah, we had actually a couple questions here about one tree in particular, and then we can move on. So just folks asking about service berries in Colorado.
Oh, sure. Yeah, their service berries are good for here. There's several species, Emelancure is the genus, and so there's Alnifolia, which is the really common one. That's probably moderately drought tolerant. Emelancure canadensis is more native. That's sold a lot in the trade. That's shadow bow, or they have other names for it, but that's more native to like Michigan, and it's not going to be as dry. I did this was actually part of my graduate work too. So that we like tried to kill shrubs by not giving them water, all these different serviceberry species. So I know more than you all care to know about this. I'm gonna try to like contain myself. Um, but the one from Michigan is not drought tolerant. So we label all service berries kind of get grouped as being drought tolerant. But it is important that there are different species that have different characteristics in a kind of a gradient from east to west. So if you want to plant serviceberry, I'd go with alnifolia, or that's the most drought tolerant tree form. And there are a lot of shrub forms too. Most of the serviceberries are shrubs or large shrubs, but still I'd say they're shrubs. So Utah ensis is a serviceberry that's native to Utah and the southwest, and it is very drought tolerant. Like we could not kill it in those trials. We didn't water it for like 2 months, and it was just in a pot in a greenhouse for 2 months without water, just growing. So, um, but yeah, so nothing, and so that's a little bit of their drought tolerance. They're great plants because they have multiple seasons of interest. Flowers are, of course, attractive. The fruit is great for wildlife, and you can eat it. A perfectly ripe serviceberry is enjoyable, but getting them when they're perfect is the key, or adding enough sugar to whatever you're doing with them. So, um, hopefully that answers your question about serviceberries.
Yeah, great. That's
And
awesome. Yeah, in that case, then I think a lot of the questions are coming in about kind of tree maintenance and care and things. And so maybe in the respective time, we can kind of move on to that section now.
perfect. I will do that. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, that's where we're going here. So those are some species, and again, it's really important to get the species right, and that's why I talk about it so much. You will never make a linden drought tolerant, right? So you have to want to start with the right species. I'm going to skip this section. I'm going to be very quick, actually. Trees to plant with caution, Freeman maples, not drought tolerant, get chlorotic in our soil, don't plant them. Same for red oak, even though they're beautiful, they're really not for most Colorado landscapes. Cottonwoods, willows, poplars need a lot of water and they get too big and they're messy for a lot of landscapes, so be very cautious planting those. We don't plant ash, right? Probably for our lifetimes because of our old ash borer. It's just like why plant a tree? You're gonna have to treat it with a pesticide for its life if you want to keep it. So unfortunately, we're also not planting ashes. Okay. That said, let's talk about planting and maintenance. So, if you're planting a tree, the very best time of year to plant a tree is early in the spring, pretty much as soon as the ground's not frozen. Anytime you can plant a tree all throughout the summer, but the hotter it is when you plant, the more care you're gonna have to and attention you're gonna have to pay to watering. You can plant trees midsummer when it's hot. It's just you cannot let them get dry or you're gonna lose things. So when you plant them early in the year, that gives them a little time to establish before the weather gets hot, to get their roots growing out in native soil and all that stuff. um, you can plant trees in the fall when it cools off, but not evergreens. They don't do well with fall planting. So newly planted trees are prone to water stress. No tree is drought tolerant until reestablishes its root systems from the little ball it came with to kind of that wide spreading natural system we looked at. So we say that it takes 1 year to establish per inch of diameter of the trunk at the time of planting. So smaller trees establish quicker is what that means. A 1 inch tree will take 1 year to establish. Everything goes right anyways. A 3 inch tree will take 3 years to establish. And there's very good evidence that starting with a smaller tree will lead to a bigger tree more quickly than if you had started with a bigger tree, if that makes sense, because they get established and start growing more quickly. So those are some general considerations. And now I'm going to do my very best to be quick, but I'm going to give you the science of how to dig a hole. I never would have thought that there was went so much into digging a hole to plant a tree, but there's a whole field around it these days, pun intended. Okay, so first, the root ball needs to sit on undug or maybe firmed if you had to add some soil to the bottom for some reason, firmed soil to keep the tree from settling as much as possible. We're going to dig a saucer-shaped planting hole, so one that tapers like that. And we would like it, if at all possible, to be 3 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. That's going to give the tree loose soil to get its roots it's going to speed establishment essentially. Dig them as big as you can. A lot of people only get to 2 times the diameter of the ball, and that's okay, but excuse me, the bigger the better in this case. The saucer shape is to direct the new roots out and up instead of if it's flat, the roots can hit it and then circle. And that creates dysfunction. I'll show you some pictures here later in the life of the tree. We also want the first root, so a tree flares out like a trumpet at its base, in where the shoot system becomes the root, as the shoot system becomes the root system. We want that flare just above grade. We want the flare and really the first root, I should say, about an inch or two above grade. There's an epidemic of too deeply planting trees, partially because extension folks like me 25 years ago used to say silly things like plant it low, watch it grow, plant it high, watch it die. And it turns out, some research was done and it's the exact opposite. So we want the tree slightly above the first root, slightly above grade. And that might mean that you have to pull soil off the top of the root ball until you find the first real root, not like fibrous roots, but the first real woody root coming off of the trunk. So yeah, 1 to 2 inches above grade. And this is what that might look like. So like this is a tree that's too deep in the pot. So the first root, it got buried in the nursery when they were like upsizing it to a bigger pot. So the first root is really here. So you'd want to remove all that soil on the top and plant it with this root an inch above grade. So these are roots that are circling because they were hitting the edge of the pot and circling. Um, those are woody. They're never going to straighten out, and so those circling roots can actually girdle the tree, putting pressure on the tree's own vascular system and restricting the flow of water and nutrients. And that's why it can take a while for a poorly planted tree to be killed by the poor planting, because it happens when the tree grows out to those roots. So the connection there I wasn't making is the roots. There are roots in here that grew up and are circling, and if you don't remove those, eventually the trunk will grow out and intersect them. So we remove all that at planting down to the first root, and then we plant at the correct depth. When we get the tree in the hole and then we add our backfill. One, there is no need to massively amend the backfill. In fact, you don't want to do that. If anything, you can put a couple shovelfuls of compost in there. That's okay, but you probably don't need to do anything. The tree is going to be growing in your soil. It's going to have a huge root system way beyond the planting hole. It needs to be able to survive in whatever soil you have on site. So we don't recommend amending that backfill too much. We would like you to put the backfill in and have the backfill come right to the top of the root ball here, but not cover it. We want this at the top of the root ball exposed so it can be easily watered. This is another issue with planting too deep, is that water, for a bunch of like really boring soil sciencey nerdy things I won't talk to you about, does not like to cross soil texture interfaces. So if you go from clay to sandy or floofed tilled soil to compacted soil, water does not want to cross that boundary. And so if you bury the tree, there's a texture difference here and at the bottom of the planting hole between the disturbed soil and the undisturbed soil. And the water will sometimes just pool all around the root ball and not really move into it because of that difference. So we want the top of the root ball exposed so we can water the root ball for at least the first year, more years than that in reality, while the tree's roots go out into the backfill. So here's the basics of that. So again, ideally 3 or more times the diameter of the planting hole, saucer shaped, diameter of the root ball. We dig a saucer shaped hole that large. We have it deep enough so the first root will be an inch or two above grade, and then we backfill in a way that doesn't cover the top of the root ball. So digging good planting. Well, this is just like a little silly thing, but it is actually kind of helpful. Um, so you can dig your hole smaller and then shave the sides of the hole and use your shavings as backfill, like you see in the picture, and that makes the planting hole bigger without you having to move all that soil twice. So that's kind of nice. So once you got the planting hole dug, if your tree, especially if your tree is containerized, it came in a pot from the nursery and has all these circling roots, we really, really, really want to remove not just the roots above the flare up there that I showed you, but any circling roots like this, we want to remove them before planting so we don't end up in that situation where we have girdling roots. And so here's just some pictures of a tree I planted, but you can see the roots circling here, right? They hit the edge of the pot and they circle, or sometimes they hit the edge of the pot and they grow up to the top. And that's not what a tree's root system should look like. It should look like the spokes of a bicycle wheel coming out from the trunk. So those circling roots are dysfunctional, they're not normal, and they can lead to problems long term. So here you can see one that was growing up, so it grew to the top, the root hit the air and the tip died, and then it started growing sideways. So this root is growing right up next to the trunk and going to be slowing down its establishment from a very young age. Here you can see another root that hit the side. Here's a root that's growing back across the trunk that hit the edge and deflected and grew back across the front. And so this is how we deal with them. We just shave them off. The first time you do this, it's traumatic, but we shave off the outer inch or so of the root ball, remove all those dysfunctional roots back to we make a clean cut so they grow hopefully normally outward away from the trunk after that. The first time you spend $150 on a tree at the nursery and do this, your like spouse is looking at you like, why are you just like setting money on fire here? But I have planted now I hundreds probably of trees this way, and I'm a big believer that it sets the tree up for better long-term success. And beyond my belief, there is a lot of research that suggests that this is stressful for trees, but the stress is brief and overcome. The tree relatively rapidly outgrows it, and it's much better than leaving the circling roots for the life of the tree. So, you shave those off, you put the tree in the hole, and then you backfill. Don't need too many backfill, I already said that. On top of the backfill, we would really recommend putting a wood mulch. So like 3 to 4 inches deep of wood mulch, not touching the trunk of the tree because you don't want moisture to be held up next to the trunk. But 3 to 4 inches of wood mulch, it will help conserve water in the planting hole. It also acts like a blanket and moderates the changes in soil temperature. So it keeps the soil cooler in the day and warmer at night and makes it a much better environment for root growth and establishment. So again, we're getting a little more hesitant about using wood mulch right next to houses, but for your little spot around your tree, it's probably it's probably okay. So that's a little on planting. Um, let's talk about what happens after planting. So this is a tree that is not being watered enough after planting. So it is failing to establish because it's not getting enough irrigation. You can see it's growing in kind of a native or dryland grass area, and it's not getting enough water. So underwatering the tree after planting leads to slower establishment. And very briefly, I've got to be careful because I'm going to run out of time, but trees have two types of roots. They have these like fine feeder roots that are so narrow, and those are the roots that absorb almost all the water and nutrients. The roots that are as big as your, pinky finger or bigger are mostly there for transportation. They are not absorbing water. So those little fine feeder roots are kind of ephemeral. They live for a period of time and then they die, and there's another flush of them. And drought can kill those fine feeder roots. So sometimes if a tree creates a flush of fine feeder roots and then you miss two waterings and it's dry and that flush dies, that means that the tree's water absorption is greatly reduced until another flush of fine feeder roots happens, which might, depending on the species, could be, who knows, weeks. And so several weeks of drought stress can actually set a tree back 1 to 2 years in terms of establishment. So we really want to be careful watering our new trees to make sure they're always kind of moist, not sopping wet, but moist. Research from the University of Michigan came out with this new guideline for watering young trees. There's a lot of things here, but essentially it says what this tells you is about 1 to 1.5 gallons of water per inch of trunk diameter for a newly planted tree. So if it's a 1 inch tree, excuse me, you're going to water with 1 gallon of water each time you water. And how often do you water? Well, you water when the first couple inches of soil around the tree are dry. So in the spring, that might mean once or twice a week. In the heat of the summer, that might mean every other day. It depends on the weather, precipitation, things like that. So that this is the new recommendation for how much to water trees if you're a precise person. I'm not that precise. Like I will just stick my finger in the soil, and when the first couple inches are dry, I water the tree till the soil around the tree feels like a wrung out sponge. So about a gallon usually. So um, so this is all that stuff. I already said all of it. Another thing to understand is that we want to water where the roots are. So the first year, the roots are mostly in the root ball it came with. So that's where we're going to focus on watering. You can water with a hose. You could even put a drip emitter when the tree's this size and probably water that root ball okay. Just put a drip emitter from your drip system on it. That's okay. We hope by the second year the tree is starting to get roots out into the backfill. If it's a 1 inch tree and is establishing relatively quickly, everything else goes right. So now we're focused on watering not just the root ball, but the backfill. So you can see where drip emitters become problematic because the tree's roots cover this big area and those little button emitters only water an area right under the emitter. But you could still, I guess, water a tree this size with 2 or 3 drip emitters if you wanted to. And then finally, by the third year, we're now watering. Hopefully, the roots are now into your native soil. We're watering this even bigger area. And, the more time that goes by, the more we need to think about ways to water this bigger area and not just water the tree with little drip emitters. I have seen so many trees, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, that were planted. They put one drip emitter on them. And then 10 years later, I get a call from a homeowner and their tree's not doing well. And they're like, well, it gets water. And it's just this one 10-year-old drip emitter at the base of the tree, which is not enough for a mature tree. So, you have to think about how the tree's water needs change as it ages. For mature trees, what we recommend is watering an area. So the drip line of the tree is like the edge of the canopy where water would drip off the tree in a rainstorm, right? So we'd say water an area like um, a bit inside the drip line, like towards the tree's trunk, and a bit out from the drip line, because that's where most of the absorptive roots are. So that's the critical area to water for mature trees. We'd like to water the whole root system if possible. And obviously, a single drip emitter is not going to water the whole drip system of a bigger tree like this. Some rules of thumb are trees in irrigated turf grass probably get enough or more than enough water from the sprinkler, so you probably don't have to worry too much about them. Um, if you're watering a tree like in a xeriscape, the rule of thumb that we have, which is maybe not perfect, is that we recommend for mature trees 10 gallons of water per inch of trunk diameter. So if it's a 10-inch tree, we'd say it needs 100 gallons of water per irrigation. And again, we'd irrigate when the top couple inches of soil have dried. Um, if we enter a bad drought and there's more water restrictions, a thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes municipal codes allow for watering of trees in drought because they recognize the trees are long-term investments and they need to be that they're worth keeping alive. But if you're like me, you look at that and think, well, if that's one tree in a small yard and its roots are all throughout the yard, if I'm allowed to water the tree, does that mean I'm just allowed to water the yard? So sometimes I think code people maybe don't have a great grasp, and I don't blame them, but it's not their field, but a great grasp of biology or woody plant biology. So, okay, perfect. We have about 10 minutes and I'll have time for questions at the end. What do we do with these mature trees in xeric conversions? What do we do? And do this is both of these situations, something happened. In this case, this tree is scorching and it may be able to be saved, but it's under a fair amount of stress. So this one they didn't plan for, and that's a problem. A thing to remember is that removing a mature tree like that could cost thousands of dollars too. So you need to plan for that in your conversion if you're going to get rid of the tree in the conversion. In this case, this was a xeric garden I used to be responsible for. They turned this cottonwood that died as the water was reduced. They just turned it into this sculpture, and actually, it fell over last year in a windstorm. But I guess that's a plan too, but maybe not the best plan. So, what I would what I would do is if you're doing a xeric conversion, the first question is, do you want to keep the tree? And some of that's just personal preference. Some of that is what is the value of the tree to you? Like, is it shading your house so it's saving you on air conditioning? So even though you're going to spend some water on it, maybe that's a trade-off that you're willing to make. It just is good for property value, so you don't want to lose it. Maybe you planted it when your child was born or something, and it's like something you're emotionally attached to. Maybe you just like trees. Um, then maybe you want to keep it. If you look at it, you go, well, that tree doesn't shade the house, and I just really don't want to I don't want to, or maybe it's like the water commitment for the tree, you just don't want to make it, then maybe, and you have the money to remove it, maybe it is better just to remove it as part of the conversion, just have it be part of your plan. Um, so that's the first step is decide whether you want to save the tree. And a lot of that's is going to be personal, just using common sense, thinking it through, etc. Um, if you do want to save the tree, the next thing to think about is as we go from a lawn to a xeric garden, like you see in the picture here, one, how do we preserve the tree's root system through the conversion? So, like if you run a tiller over the soil, and I mentioned trees' roots are pretty shallow, you're going to tear up a lot of roots with that tiller, and that's stressful for the tree. So maybe right under the tree, within the drip line of the tree or something along those lines, we don't till the soil. Maybe we smother grass in there. Maybe I'm not, everyone's got a different tolerance for this stuff. Maybe use Roundup in that area to kill the grass, but you don't disturb the root system. So we want to protect the tree's root system and then make a plan to water the tree for the long term. So a couple drip emitters, those little button emitters, is not a plan. You want to be thinking about how to water a larger portion of that tree's root system. So again, remembering this is what a tree's root system kind of looks like. Your two best options for watering mature trees either are these are drip hoses. Excuse me, I'm on the tail end of a cold, and the more I talk, the kind of stuffier I get. But um, these are drip hoses. So what with inline emitters? So in this drip line, there is an emitter every 8 or 12 inches. So they water a little more uniformly. But when you put them around the tree like this, you're watering the whole root system, and you're watering very efficiently because you're using drip, you're watering close to the surface, all those things. So that's an option. Another good option. And then, in landscape, sorry, before I go on, another thing I should say is that in landscape design, you can use that area next to the tree if there's maybe something that's like slightly less xeric or maybe towards mesic that you just want to grow one or two of them because you love them. You can know that this little area around the tree is your higher water use zone and maybe get away with growing a few of your favorites that do need a little water. That's another kind of cool way to think about it too, I think. Um, and there are tons of xeric plants that are cool. It's not just the water plants that are cool. So I don't want to give that impression either. But if you have a favorite, you could grow it in that area. This is another way you can water near the trees. These are called orchard sprinklers, or sometimes called bubblers. So they're large droplet, low pressure sprinklers that spray that irrigate either usually either like a 3, 6, or 9 foot I think radius around them, and they're used in orchards. That's why they get that name. But because their droplets are large, they don't blow with the wind as much, so they're very efficient and they're very low to the ground as well. So and they plug right into a drip line and work. So this could be another way. So each one of these is irrigating a little bubble by the tree. So you're watering its whole root system without having to water the whole landscape. So planning this in when you do your conversion will help your tree not have stress, which could predispose to other problems like pests and things like that, and not die, which is obviously the goal if you're still irrigating it. Um, the key here is you're going to need two zones. So you need a separate zone to irrigate the tree. So you're not just watering the whole xeric garden on the same schedule as the tree. So during your planning, you want to build in a zone for watering the trees. That's the one that maybe you water slightly more often. For mature trees, every other week, it's definitely better to like irrigate deeper with more water, but less frequently for trees' health. So it'd be something where you water deeply every other week during a hot summer if there's no rain. I think that's probably a pretty good recommendation for most species of mesic or medium to high water use trees. Some of the things I talked about, you could get away with irrigating a lot less once they're established. Again, remembering they have to be established to have any drought tolerance. Another thing to think about with your trees is winter watering. I'm just going to throw in a plug for this. This is a much younger, you can see I'm not quite as bald in that picture. Me watering this little redbud that we had. So winter watering at newly planted trees is always a good idea. We say water them once a month if we don't get an inch of moisture in that month. And so I just would take this little bucket of water out there on the first of the month. I put a timer in my iPhone, in my cell phone that tells me on the first of the month, it reminds me to water the tree, and I would just take a bucket of water out to it. You could also use a sprinkler on a warm day to water a bigger tree. Most important with young trees and conifers during dry periods. Um, Not as important for mature deciduous trees. In terms of drip irrigation, just another note, and this is just to drive it home, especially during these conversions with mature trees, just remember that you're invested with your tree, which we are invested in being successful because it was expensive, because if it doesn't live at least 7 years, your effort to grow a tree was bad for the environment for the reasons I talked about earlier. So we want to put the time in to think these things through. So these little button emitters that only water small areas, I mean, good maybe for the tree's first year, but after that, these are not the way to water trees. We rather use drip tape. This is a smaller drip tape. Same idea, but you can get this at the Home Depot, get a big roll of it. for very affordable, or Lowe's or any hardware store. So um, drip is good. Drip is efficient, but for trees, you need the right type of drip or you're gonna run eventually into problems. So um, last thing to think about there. And I got done quicker than I thought. I started rushing. So we have plenty of time for questions. I've seen the Q&A thing lighting up. I'm happy to open it and read through them if that would be helpful for the team, or if there's ones you want to bring to me, I can do that too.
Yeah, actually, Eric, I'm having some trouble with my audio. I had to call in to listen to you. So if you're able to answer some questions
I
from
can do
there, I
that.
think that would
Yep.
be super helpful
There's
for me. I
actually
appreciate
16
that.
open. I probably won't get to all 16, but let's do some questions here. I have some other resources up here. This is Adams County Master Gardeners, but you can look up for any of your local master gardeners. They'll answer questions for you. Plant Select markets plants that are well adapted for the Intermountain West. We have a blog, CSU Extension does, where we talk about topics like this all the time. If you want to subscribe to that, you can. And then we have a fact sheets on trees and which trees to plant and tree planting steps you can find with those Google searches I have here. I thought I updated my phone number in this. This is not my phone number. I will fix it and put it in the chat. There is someone who will answer horticulture questions at that number, but they are not me. So that's in my old job in Adams County. Sorry, that was last year. Okay, so questions. Spruces you would recommend. Well, yeah, spruces are tricky. I don't think blue spruce, which is the most common, is really good for most residential landscapes, unfortunately. It's native, but it's not native to here. It's native to someplace up in the mountains where the conditions are much different. It also gets too big. So for spruces, I would really I like Black Hills spruce a little bit better. It's a smaller, it's very similar to blue spruce, but smaller. So if you want a spruce, that's the one I'd go with, is Black Hills spruce, probably. Um, Trying to think if I'm missing any other ones. The only other spruces we also can grow white spruce. That one's okay. Um, I like Black Hills better, and we can grow Engelmann spruce, which is like blue spruce's cousin that goes even higher in the mountains and probably is not for most foliage landscapes. So Black Hills would be my number one there. Um, Answer live. I'll click that. Crab apples. Okay, I didn't talk about crab apples in my talk, but I gotta say we have given crab apples were like your parents' or grandparents' favorite tree. They were planted all across the country. They're crab apples that are native to North America. Of course, the primordial forest for apples are in Kazakhstan, where it's very similar climate to here. They're very well adapted for here. They're great for pollinators. They're great for habitat. They are tough. So I am pro crabapple. There are a ton of varieties though. So just make sure you plant the right one. And the things you want are one that is the biggest thing you want is one that is resistant to fire blight. That's the disease that it's a bacterial disease crab apples get. So we have a fact sheet from CSU Extension just about crab apples. And if you go CSU Extension crab apples, that'll come up, and you can get our research trial where we tested for that and other factors and find one that you like. Um, a fruitless one that's really famous that's resistant is uh, spring snow. That's one if you just want one recommendation for crab apple. Chokecherry. Yeah, so chokecherry is one of our natives. I wouldn't, they're not, I mean, like if you see them in the foothills, you'll see them growing in disturbed areas. They're not like the furthest, or like by streams, right? So they're not the furthest on the drought tolerance like spectrum, but I would say they are drought tolerant. Um, there's lots of them on the market. The native ones, if you just buy like from grown from seed, tend to sucker and form thickets. So be careful about that. Make sure they have space if that's what you're doing. A lot of the ones in the trade are grafted. So they take a variety with pretty flowers, take a twig off of it, and then do some Frankenstein stuff and attach it to a desirable rootstock. So they try to pick rootstocks that don't sucker as much, but oftentimes they will sucker. The one you mentioned specifically, Sucker Punch, is probably the best I've seen at not suckering. If they get under a lot of stress, people complain that they sucker. The two that are in my life that I planted for work purposes, I have never seen sucker. So, and unfortunately, you may not be able to find Sucker Punch much going forward. It's really falling out of favor with the industry because they got complaints about it suckering. So they're growing other ones. So, that's my take on Sucker Punch. I still think it's a very nice choke cherry, but it's going to be harder to find in the trade. Uh, Bare root trees. Bare root is fine. Bare root is cheaper. Bare root sometimes can, let if you have like a bigger planting with like a lot of trees, will make it much more affordable. But bare root is really just for the spring. Bare root stock is perishable, so you have to be very careful. You buy it, you want to make sure the nursery stored it correctly, or if it's mail order, they'll try to ship it to you correctly at the correct time. Um, and then before you plant it, you want to store it in a cool, dark place with like maybe like wet burlap around its roots to keep the roots hydrated, because it's just more perishable than containerized stuff. So we have a fact sheet on that too. I have no problem with bare root. It's probably more sustainable environmentally. It's just that there's this narrow window of the year when you can do it. So that's the story there. Well, let's see. Let's go down our list here. We gotta scroll. Burp. What if you planted a tree 2 years ago and aren't sure if you kept the two structural roots like high enough, like near the surface? So yeah, you can poke around there, just go in with a good pair of gloves and gently pull the soil back from the base. And if you find a root right near the surface, you're probably fine. If you pull the soil back and all you're getting is trunk going straight into the ground like a telephone pole, that probably means that you just need to pull some soil off there and kind of create a saucer on the top of the planting hole to like let the root flare breathe and to avoid circling roots. So just create a concave hole down to where you find the first root, kind of right near the trunk. And you can fill that with peat gravel if you want, if it looks unsightly or you're worried about tripping. But that's hopefully that makes sense. That's what my advice would be in that situation. What about washing the root ball and most of the soil before planting? Yeah, that's another option is root washing. So you wash away all the soil, you array the roots manually, or you plant it like a bare root tree essentially. So you arrange the roots kind of manually in the right way. You can do that. Yeah, there's research that shows that it works. I think shaving is just as effective, a lot easier. And that's why I favor shaving. But if you want to wash and not shave, because you cannot stand to see a single root dehydrate on the ground after you've cut it, that's totally fine. Can you unwind the circular roots and separate them out into a saucer instead of shaving them off? That's just what I was talking about. You can. It's a lot of work. The research shows that it's pretty much not just in any like scientifically way distinguishably better to do that than shave. That's why I recommend shaving, but you definitely can. Tease them all out to straight is fine too. Better to do on a cool day and don't let the roots dry out once all the soil's off them or they can die. Okay. Instead of shaving, could you bare root them? Yep. Okay. You all are like tree experts. Like this is high level stuff. You're all throwing it out there. But yeah, I think I already answered that one. If the tree is small, blue weeping willow is okay to plant it in a berm. Yeah, you can plant things in a berm. It's a lot harder, not harder, maybe it's not the right word, but it's a lot more important to keep them well watered when they're young in a berm because that just the way gravity works, that berm will drain better than the surrounding soil and tends to be drier. So sure, you can plant trees in a berm. Just make sure that you keep them moist while they get their roots out into the rest of the landscape. I wouldn't plant, I know people love those weeping willows, and if you have one, I'm not judging you, but wouldn't be my number one choice for Colorado, especially if water-wise is a concern for you. But if you have one, they are beautiful. So, okay. Can I spell the serviceberry trees? No, is the answer. If you email me, I will send you a list of all the service berries. I will put my correct email in the chat right now. I will send you more than you ever wanted to know about service berries, including their correct spellings. So let me chat to. Oh, I think I can only chat to hosts and panelists. So maybe if one of you can paste this into the chat for me. It's the exact same as the one there, but it's at bouldercounty.gov. Bouldercounty.gov. So if you're taking notes, that's ehammond at bouldercounty.gov. Thoughts on deep root watering? Deep root watering. Well, you should water as deep as the roots are, which is about 12 inches. Those 3 foot needles don't, there's nothing magical about that. It's probably better for everyone around if you just get a sprinkler and water from the top down, enough to saturate the top 12 inches. Don't need to pay for those 3 foot long needles. That's not effective. Fertilization. Don't get me started. We're running out of time. the research on fertilizing trees is super interesting. And lots of times, what happens when you fertilize is that sometimes with nitrogen fertilizer, you push top growth, which you think would be desirable, but a tree's balance of roots to shoots is really important. So pushing a bunch of top growth can actually stress a tree out in the long run because it needs to maintain the correct balance between roots and shoots. Some of the research about fertilizing trees shows like no results from fertilizing them, which is wild because they're definitely absorbing nutrients. So like very interesting. If a tree's growing in turf grass, it does not need additional fertilization if you're fertilizing the turf grass is the bottom line. If it's growing in rock or something like that, a low nitrogen fertilizer may be helpful, but probably is not absolutely necessary either. So a fertilizer with a low first number, like less than 10 on the bag. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm gonna get as many of these as I can. Russian Hawthorn's opinion pine would be a great combination for a windbreak. So that's a very individual question, but yes, go for it. I love the way you're thinking. A 10-inch tree would need 100 gallons. Is it every day per week? Yeah, sorry. I tried to say that. Maybe I didn't do a good job. So you're going to 100 gallons per irrigation, but you're going to water when the top like 3-ish inches of soil are dry to the touch. And in the summer, that might be every other week. Um, in the spring and fall, it might be twice a month. If it rains, it might be never. So like it depends on conditions, if that makes sense. Okay. Hand watering newly planted trees. For a newly planted tree, for the first year or two, drip's fine. I like to hand water because it makes me think about the tree and I'm much more likely to pay attention to it. But for the first few years, drip is fine. After that, it gets to be harder to water with drip. Stake watering systems are fine. Stake or bag watering systems are fine. Again, though, they're really not necessary. Like a drip emitter or a hose is just as good. Um, the bags, I find people like tend to lean on those bags as a crutch. They fill them up and then forget about it. It's like the bag empties, but they're just like assuming the bag's taking care of it. So you still have to pay attention to the tree even though you have those bags. So I know you didn't ask about those, but it's kind of related. But they're fine if you want to use them and pay attention to them. I already talked about deep root watering, water from the top down, water the top 12 inches or so. So there's a question here about a split in the bark of a maple tree. The best thing you can do for any damage to a tree's bark is not to paint it or wrap it. Well, you might want to wrap it in the winter to prevent further sun scald on the tree, but just to let the tree naturally close the wound. Trees know how to deal with wounds. They don't need our help. Just let it naturally close. This is a long one. Our town requires trees at park. Oh, yeah, health strips. Uh, Overwatering their bluegrass and so increase root drowning. What do you recommend to avoid this? Yeah, I mean, watering those hell strips is just difficult. They're a weird shape. It's hard to water them correctly. My recommendation would be like work with your town to like very reasonably make an argument that do we need to have turf grass in those hell strips? Can we have something else that's not so hard to water and that's going to help you have more success with the tree? If you are watering them, they do make MP rotators that spray like these like I don't have probably time to explain what MTB are, but they're very efficient sprinklers, and they make them in rectangle and square shapes specifically for hell strips to go in the corners. So that would be your best bet if you're not changing the bluegrass out there. Netaphene is a great way to water mature trees. That's that drip tape I was talking about. Used to be you could only buy it from this one company in Israel. Now it's generic. Anyone can buy it. It's very affordable. Netaphene was the name of the original product from Israel. When I'm out of time, stop me. I'm just going to keep trying to. I'm almost through them, I think. Hot wings maples are fine, pretty drought tolerant. Plums, the native plum is pretty drought tolerant. So the question is hot wings, maples, plums, and cherries, assuming are those good trees? Hot wings, maples, plums are both fine. Cherries, the tart cherries are a little tougher. The sweet cherries are not very tough. Choke cherries, our native cherries are more on the tougher end of the spectrum.
So you said that, Eric, and then we did actually get to 8. And I
Okay.
appreciate everyone's questions, but we're getting more as time goes on. So
Oh, I'm not
I think
making,
we
okay,
do.
I'm just losing. Yeah, hands down, exam's over.
Yeah.
You can shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to answer your questions as well. Anyone who's still listening. So.
Awesome. Yeah, again, thank you everyone. Thank you so much, Eric, for this awesome presentation. Again, we will be recording this, and so we're currently recording it, and so we'll send that out later on. And yeah, thank you for so much for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And I totally understand also sending them in as we've extended this session. So like Eric said, send them in to him or your local extension office. And then if you have any questions about Resource Central or our Waterwise landscaping resources, our email is in the chat as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again, Eric and Spencer. We'll hang on here for just a little bit, but I hope everyone has a good night.